Hello, this is Alasdair Post-Quinn from Fallingblog Designs. You can find me at double-knitting.com. Welcome to the third episode of the Fallingblog Podcast, and I hope that in the future I'll be able to be a little more consistent about the timing on these. I have run into some technical difficulties, and I have been unable to find a better way to do the green screen. If you saw the last episode, you may have noticed that the green screen was a little bit glitchy, and I really couldn't find a way to improve it. So in the end, rather than using the live background of my office/storage room here that I'm sitting in, I opted to just hang a fabric backdrop and call it good. I've also struggled a little bit with timing and lighting. This is a very bright room, and so I have to basically either choose to do it at night when I control the lighting, or do it during the day with shades pulled and hope for the best. I'm also a little bit limited due to my cat. Longfellow is he likes to make sure that he can get everywhere in the apartment. And he's not allowed in this room most of the time. He doesn't really care so much as long as I'm not in here. But if I am, and he's awake, and he notices that I'm not here, and he figures out that I'm in this room, he will cry and cry and cry, and you will be able to hear it on the microphone. So I am doing my best to find time when all of these things come together and allow me the ability to do this podcast. So, without further ado, here's the Falling Blocks Report. The Falling Blocks Report is a segment where I get to talk a little bit about something going on in my knitting life, and maybe something going on outside my knitting life. I'm going to start off with stuff from outside the knitting life. Those of you who have been following me for a little while probably know that a little less than a year ago, my home and studio burned down. I lost almost everything. I was able to get back some of my knitting stuff during the demolition. But the rebuild of that condo building, we owned a condo in the condo building. The rebuild of that building has been delayed somewhat due to some contentious stuff going on among the owners, and it's difficult to proceed without everybody on board. So we're hoping that this stuff gets resolved soon, and we can get on track for rebuilding and getting back to a place that I can actually call home. I'm happy to have the place that I'm in now, but it's just a rental, and as homey as it feels, and as nice as it is, it's not home per se. For the time being, the space that I have to use is the space I'm going to continue using to do these podcasts. I'm currently in negotiation to stick around here for another year or so. Stay tuned, I'll let you know if anything interesting happens on that front. But meanwhile, let's switch over to the knitting content. In this segment, I want to talk about my workshops. Now, in the first episode, I talked about the podcast itself. In the second episode, I talked about my Patreon. And now I want to talk about my workshops. The workshops are really a huge portion of my knitting business. Because this is where I get to teach people how to do the stuff that I'm doing. Now, the books and patterns are a fantastic resource, but sometimes there's just no substitute for a real-life person showing you stuff in more or less live circumstances. Now, of course, it's COVID times at the moment, which means that all the live workshops are actually virtually live. But I am still here doing stuff and taking questions live and showing you my hands live, and the one thing that you don't have is me coming around and being able to directly troubleshoot your work. But the one thing that you get to save is a whole lot of money and time doing traveling to a large event where you might be taking these live workshops. So I'm going to switch over to a browser mode here so that you can see a little bit about where you can find out about my workshops. This is my calendar, and as you can see, there's a URL down there in the bottom of the screen. I will also copy that URL into the description of this video so that it'll be easily clickable. As you can see, I've got a presentation. I've got a number of guild presentations that I'm going to be doing soon. I've got workshops for the Stitches events. Another presentation. Workshops for the Vogue events, Virtual Knitting Live. And then I have my own standalone workshops in the Building Blocks collection of workshops. Another place that you can go to see my workshops is if you go to my Learn link at the top of my website, or double-knitting.com/learn. Note that it says resources for learning double knitting. This gives you a number of different places, both in-person and virtual workshops. Now, the same in-person workshops that I typically teach are also done virtually, and so this is a listing of what I currently offer in double knitting. Let's go to one as an example. Marling with double knitting is one of my newest workshops, although a technique that I have been doing for quite some time. And as you can see down here at the bottom of it, we have a little mini calendar that just shows you when this particular workshop's next appearance is going to be. As you can see, it's a Building Blocks workshop. So going back to the Learn tab again, let's go to the Building Blocks page, just so I can explain to you what the difference is. I teach my own virtual workshops without a middleman under the Building Blocks name. Now, just a quick history. Building Blocks was an actual physical event that I ran in spring of 2019, I believe, in the before times. And it was an attempt to sort of cut out the middleman and do something like what people are used to doing in conference centers and hotel conference rooms, which is where most of the big events happen, where I'm up at the front of the classroom and everyone is in a big U shape and I am doing a live video projection on a large screen behind me. To be perfectly honest, a lot of the technology that I use in those classes, those live classes, translates quite well to virtual workshops. The Building Blocks virtual workshops are basically an attempt for me to teach these workshops the way I want to teach them without going through a big show, and allows me to do a number of things that are unique. So the first thing is that unlike the big shows like Stitches or Vogue, who limit the workshops to 2 hours long, because, and you know, it's for a perfectly good scientific reason that a lot of people start to tune out after a couple of hours on Zoom. But I found that every now and then it's okay to do a 3-hour one as long as you give people a break in the middle. And I'm able to do more with these workshops. I'm able to fully manifest these workshops in the virtual space, as opposed to in a 2-hour slot. Some of those workshops have to get stripped down a little bit in order to fit in that 2-hour slot. The fee is also something that I have some control over, although to be honest, you have more control over it because I make it a sliding scale fee. And if you choose to go higher than the minimum, that's always much appreciated, but even if you don't, if a workshop is filled to halfway and everyone pays the bare minimum, then essentially I am getting roughly what I would be making at any of the big shows for teaching the same workshop. So as you can see, if it fills more, or if people add a little bit to their enrollment fees, this all works out pretty well for me. And the fees tend to still be lower than your average big show's fees, because I have really no overhead here, or very, very little. I'm also able to run workshops that the big shows don't typically run. As you can see, I've got double knit entrelac in here. And depending on when you view this video, if it's before April 17th, there may very well still be space in that. Marling with double knitting. This is a brand new workshop. It's only been run, I think, once, maybe twice in the big shows, and this is my first time running it here. But of course, I'm always going to be running some of the standard things like the good old intro to double knitting. So as I add more, this calendar will lengthen or shorten as things pass. So in short, if you want to see all of my workshops, go to double-knitting.com/calendar. If you want to see just the workshops that I'm running, you can go to double-knitting.com/buildingblocks. And if you want to go to a specific workshop and see when that workshop is coming up next, if there's something on the books through any venue, go to the workshop's own page within double-knitting.com/learn. The next segment I have for you is What's on My Needles. And in fact, quite a bit of this is what's just off my needles, because I've gotten some things done, which is nice, and also what's off of somebody else's needles who was working for me, as I have some sample knitters who just returned a couple of new things. So I'm going to switch again to a different view here. And here we have my hand camera. And so the first thing I'm going to show you is something that you've seen in a number of forms throughout the last couple of episodes and perhaps beyond that. And that is, finally, the Spinneret. This is the metal hat from the Wuxing 5 Elements collection. And let me turn down the brim so that you can see the whole thing. Of course, you're not going to be able to see the whole thing, so I'll scroll down it a bit. So I've mentioned this before and I've explained what's going on, but now that you can see the entire thing, the effect really comes into sharp relief. So we have 3 different backgrounds. We have reverse double knitting in 2 different colors. And of course, it's reversible, so on the other side of each of these is the other color. And then a marled section, which combines the 2. And the marled section obviously looks about the same on the other side, except that, of course, the droplet is a different color. So all of that I've explained already. And we have 12 of these droplets all the way around, and we have 3 different backgrounds. So the backgrounds change in such a way that there's always a different background than the color of the drop. So they're not just in easy sequence. It's dark, light, marled, light, dark, marled. So it's a 6 panel repeat. And then the same thing happens on the other side. So let me turn this inside out. As you can see, this is actually the front of it. There's no real significant difference between the 2 layers, except that the cables are running in an opposite direction. And the reason why, though, it's important that this be double knitting is because there are a couple of things that you're doing here that you can't easily do in single layer knitting. Obviously, one of them is changing these backgrounds, but the other one, and this is the most fascinating one to me, and really the newest concept that I've gotten to play with, is the color changing of the cables. So as each of the cables travels across different backgrounds, it has the option to color change. Now, it won't always color change because sometimes it's going to hit a marled background, in which case it doesn't matter what color it is. But just to keep things interesting, I've made it alternate along the marled sections. So we have dark, light, dark, light, dark, light. There's a logic to the way that these color transitions happen or don't happen, and the logic is actually written out in the pattern. So the pattern will be out soon, and it may very well be out by the time that you are watching this, but this is such an unusual and complex pattern that I really did need to pass it by test knitters. Some get passed by test knitters and some don't, but this one very definitely needed to be. And so most of the test knitters have gotten back to me. I need to compile their comments. But the other thing that I need to do, and the hope was that one of the test knitters would do this for me, but I had no way of forcing it to happen, was that the only way that this can be easily sized is by bringing it up a needle size. And so since nobody else did this on a needle size up, I've chosen to start again on a US 3. Now this has been blocked somewhat, so it's already a little wider. I mean, the repeat that I have here on my needle is about the same size as what we have here, but really the question is not the size at its relaxed point, but what it's capable of stretching to. This piece does not distort very much when stretched, but it only stretches up to a certain very rigid upper limit. So this hat is capable of fitting comfortably anyone who's got an 18 to 22 inch head. My head, being about 22.5 to 23, won't fit this hat. But I have speculated that a US 3 needle version will. So I'm double checking that to make sure that the gauge works out. I think it will. And then this pattern will come out finally after months of agonizing over the pattern design, etc. It will also come out along with Pluvium, which is the water hat that has been done for months at this point, actually almost a year, because I took the picture of it just before my house burnt down, which has been almost a year now. So, anyway, this is Spinneret. Check out the Wooshing 5 Elements collection. There will be a link in the description of the video. And whether or not it's available, buy into the collection. This will get dropped into your Ravelry library when the pattern comes out. Now, the other two pieces that I have are recently back from sample knitters, and it's just a coincidence that they look similar. The first one is a revision of my Falling Blocks hat. So Falling Blocks was a 3-color tumbling blocks pattern on one layer and a completely different pattern on the other layer. It was my first 2-pattern piece, but it is in 3 colors, and I always felt that I had jumped the gun a little bit by doing it in 3 when I could have done it in 2 first. And so I went back and I redesigned it in 2. This is called Falling Blocks Redux, and as you can see, we have the tumbling blocks pattern on one layer. Lovely crown that goes all the way up, as crowns do. The reason that I mention that is that the other layer is a completely different pattern. Also, just a 2-color derivative version of the 3-color inner layer of the original Falling Blocks hat. And also, like the revised version of the Falling Blocks hat, the crown goes all the way to the top on both layers. So this is a 2-color, 2-pattern, all over pattern, and as you can see, 2 different layers that are radically different from each other. This is a great place to start if you have just learned 2-pattern double knitting at, say, one of my workshops, and would like to practice the technique. I have had people do the original Falling Blocks hat who did not know how to do double knitting prior to it, just following the chart and the key, and they were able to generate the hat. This works the same way, just simpler, because there are only 2 colors to keep track of. Now the other one, as you can see, is quite a derivative pattern. This is called Shadow Boxes, and as a matter of fact, this was out originally in the Willow Yarns Colorwork Club. Of course, what I did here is that I just took the original Falling Blocks hat, I made it into 2 colors, just in the same way that I did with the Tumbling Blocks pattern on the outside of Falling Blocks Redux, and then I stripped out columns of cubes, and I made this sort of shadow effect for the cubes, and I'll flip it inside out so you can see the other side. This is done in exactly the same yarn and exactly the same colors that the original one was done in, just to keep things simple. To some degree, I feel like I should perhaps have redesigned this in a sport weight, but I just wanted to keep it simple and stick to the original design and get it back out there. So here it is, the Shadow Boxes hat. So that's what's on my needles, and the next segment is going to be a pattern focus on Heartbound Again by request. This is the pattern focus segment in which I'm going to give you a little bit of background info and story and design process and whatever about a particular pattern. And in the last episode of the podcast, I asked if anyone wanted to request a pattern, and user Lisa B399 requested the Heartbound Again hat, and I saw no reason not to do it. So I want to talk a little bit about this hat and how it came to be. So I'm going to switch to another view here where you can see some pictures I've put together. And this, of course, is the Heartbound Again hat. This was done for Double or Nothing and is still available in that book and is not available as a standalone pattern. It's quite an involved pattern and really just kind of has to stay in the book. So the reason it's called Heartbound Again is because there was another pattern before it called Heartbound. And that pattern's no longer available, but let me tell you a little bit about it. I'll show you a picture of it in just a minute. So initially I developed double knit cables, and I'll tell you sort of the story of that in a minute. But I was teaching double knit cables, and I realized that I didn't really have any solid examples of double knit cables for people to play with aside from the swatch. I did have a previous hat that I called double knit cabled, but it didn't really fit with the way that I had figured out how to do double knit cables and was teaching at the time. So I designed this pattern called Heartbound. And as you can see, it's reverse double knitting as a background and cables across the body of the hat. And I sort of thought that they looked a little like hearts in the way that they came together, but also knots, so therefore Heartbound. So prior to Heartbound, the only cabled pattern that I had was the Vasily hat, which shows up on the front cover of Extreme Double Knitting. This hat is double knit cabled, but the way that the cables are done is more like the way standard single layer reversible cables are done with 1x1 ribbing. I'm taking the entire fabric and cabling it. The limitation to this is that I could not actually do cables that travel across a background. Because it's a fully reversible cable technique, both layers have to look like cables, but they twist in opposite directions because of the nature of the cable twist. So cables can't travel along a negative background if the other layer twists in the opposite direction. Then the background would simply travel across the cable. This is what I believe to be the case. I didn't think that there was an elegant way to do double knit cables that traveled along a negative background. And so this is what I put out as a possibility for extreme double knitting. That came out in October of 2011, and in January of 2012, while I was teaching a workshop, I had an epiphany and I figured out how to do not only one but two different methods of double knit cables using a cable needle or no cable needle. So these are the methods that I teach now, and this is the pattern that I generated to give people something to play with when they were done taking my double knit cable class. The problem with this pattern, and the reason that it's no longer available as a standalone pattern, is because the cast on and bind off look terrible. And I don't know if you can see it easily, but casting on and going straight into reverse double knitting looks awful. Now, it's possible that there's another cast on that we could use that might look a little better, but the standard cast on that I use, and I even tested it with the Italian two-color cast on for something a little more invisible, and I still had the same issue. In the end, I decided I was going to do something a little different with this pattern. And the first thing that I wanted to do is I wanted to expand it to a full hat. So this is Heartbound Again, the hat version. What might not be super visible in this photo is that there's a double knit I-cord cast on, and that'll be more visible in a future photo. The double knit I-cord cast on was a way for me to sort of echo the look of the cables and also make the cast on not look so terrible. It's a fairly time-consuming process, but when you're done, you end up with this lovely I-cord, and all of the stitches that are coming off of one side of that I-cord end up being used to generate the reverse double knitting fabric. So there's another view of it. So the first photo, this one, was taken at the Cloisters in New York. Actually, a lot of the photos were taken at the botanical garden around the Cloisters. And when we actually got to the Cloisters building itself, we took a few photos, and then a security guard came and kicked us out and said, "You can't take photos here unless you've made an appointment." We're like, "We're not in the building, we're just like along the outside." And he said, "Doesn't matter, you gotta go." And so we went. And we went just out of sight and took some photos a little further away from the building where he couldn't see us. And honestly, this is the one that gets used to promote this hat most often. So, having done the hat, I went back to revisit the concept of the headband. And so here's the Heartbound Again headband. It's part of the same pattern. It's an option in the pattern. You simply stop at a certain point with the cables and finish them off with one extra chart. And then not only is there an I-cord cast on, there's also an I-cord bind off, and you can see both of them nicely and clearly in this photo. So I'm going to switch back to here and say neither of those pieces survived the fire. However, I have some very generous sample knitters who were willing to help me replace these patterns. I have a number of sample knitters working on, I think, about a dozen different patterns that didn't make it, and these two actually came back right around the same time. And this one, thank you to Lisa. Is it the same Lisa? I bet it's the same Lisa who requested this this segment. Maybe not, but this one is, as you can see, the same hat, highly contrasty. One of the things I didn't like about the original version of this was that it was such low contrast. Looked great in bright sun, but anything else was just not quite contrasty enough. So I decided to lighten the blue brighten the red, and got this. So, and then thanks also to Claudia, who did the same in the headband version. Not quite the same colors, but very close. So if you've got any particular patterns of mine that you like and want to hear more about their story, please feel free to add something in the comments, and I just might take up your suggestion. Thank you. Now, at this point, I would normally do some kind of signal boost, but I have been running late on getting this podcast out, and the signal boosts are hard to do because I really want to coordinate with the person or people that I'm going to be signal boosting for, and that's not always a simple task. So I'm going to skip the signal boost for this one. Hopefully I'll get it back in the next one. There are lots of people doing cool stuff out there, and I want more views for those folks. So the final segment is going to be the technique of the month. And technique of the month this month is going to be double knit decreases. Double knit decreases are commonly used in hats and other kinds of shaping as well, but if you want to do something that doesn't involve increases, double knit decreases alone are a good way to get into doing hats. I do a lot of hats, as you probably have noticed. I enjoy working on them. I enjoy figuring out the crowns, and they're a great small-ish, but not too small, venue for a new technique or two. You can learn a lot of good techniques just by doing a hat. So without further ado, here's double knit decreases. Just single decreases right now. You'll get double decreases in a future episode. Now the first thing that you have to do is, in order to decrease these next two pairs into a single pair, you have to reorder them from knit, purl into knit, knit, purl, purl. And the key to that is, I'll do it with my fingers here, you have a knit and then a purl and then knit and then a purl. The key is that you want to take the two middle stitches in those two pairs and switch them. Note that the outer two stay where they are, it's just the middle two that switch. Then you've got two knits in a row and two purls in a row, and then they can be decreased. So there are two main ways of doing this. One of them is similar to a cabling without a cable needle technique, and one of them isn't. The one that I typically use involves holding on to the two knit stitches. Note that I've skipped over that purl. I'm going to pull the needle out, I'm going to pull the left-hand needle out of those three stitches. These two are held, this one is going to be released, and you're going to catch it on the back. Like that. Now if your yarn is very slippery, you can sort of pinch at the base and that will perhaps keep it from falling down, but you're not releasing it for very long. One way or the other, you have two knits in a row and two purls in a row. Now I'm going to put that back and I'm going to show you the other method. We are now back at two pairs, knit, purl, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to slip one stitch, and then I'm going to slip these next two as if to knit two together. Note that they've now reordered themselves from knit, purl to knit, knit, purl, purl. However, these two stitches are now twisted. So as I slip them back, I have to untwist them. So at this point, we can do a decrease. Now the direction of the decrease will depend on what you have in your chart. The first one that I'm going to demonstrate is a left slanting decrease, and that has a symbol that looks like this. A left slanting decrease on the knit side is an SSK. You can also do an SKP if you prefer. I'm going to demo it as an SSK. So, yarns to the back, slip two knitwise, put the left hand needle into the front, leaving the right hand needle in place for a knit two together through the back of the loop. And for the moment, we're just going to use the colors as they appear. So that's a left slanting decrease on the knit side, but it also has to be followed up by a left slanting decrease on the purl side, which is just a purl two together. Now I'm just going to work a couple of pairs forward, and then I'm going to reorder another 2 pairs to show the right slanting decrease. So these next 2 pairs, I'm going to reorder them in the same way that I reordered the last ones, to get 2 knits in a row and 2 purls in a row. And now I'm going to do a right slanting decrease. As you can imagine, the right slanting decreases symbol looks like this. And I'm just doing a knit 2 together with the first 2 knits here. This gives you a right slanting decrease on the knit side. Now, the mirror image version of that, a right slanting decrease on the purl side, is an SSP, which is an unusual technique, so watch carefully. I'm going to start out by bringing both yarns to the front, then I'm going to slip both stitches individually knitwise. I realize they're purls, I'm going to slip them knitwise, and then I'm going to pass them back to the left-hand needle. Now I'm going to insert my needle through the back of the loop of both, so I'm purling 2 together through the back of the loop. Now, here is the left slanting decrease right here. Now, as you can see, a left slanting decrease has the rightmost stitch of the 2 stitches that were decreased on top. The rightmost stitch is on top, therefore it slants to the left. There's a right slanting decrease. The leftmost stitch of the 2 stitches involved is on top, which means that it slants to the right. Now let me turn it over. This one is the mirror image of the left slanting decrease. It's left slanting as viewed from the other layer, which means that at this point it looks like it's right slanting, since you've turned it over. And this one, same thing. It's a mirror image version. As viewed from the other side, it's right slanting, so when you turn it over, it looks to be left slanting. The important thing, though, is that it's slanting in the same direction as its corresponding decrease on the other layer. This is Alasdair Post-Quinn, and this has been the Fallingblog Podcast, Episode 3. If you haven't checked out the other 2 episodes, please do that, and if you want to see more of them and other stuff that I might be posting to my YouTube channel, please do make sure to subscribe here. I should also mention that, as I said in my last episode, the personal channel that I used to maintain that had some knitting content, all that knitting content has been moved over here, and I have scrubbed that channel of all knitting content. So sadly, tens of thousands of views and lots of comments, all gone. So I do apologize for that. There's no way for me to move the videos over from one channel to the other. So I just had to start fresh with them. Thanks so much for watching, and stay tuned. I hope to have another one of these out for you in about a month.